On to New Zealanders.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I called Sumarone.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And tomorrow we get to learn the exact nature of the betrayal. Tomorrow we get to know the exact nature of the betrayal of preschool, early education children. Because before the election, it was a high priority. And even into last year, John Key was still saying early childhood education is a high priority. But suddenly the sentence slipped out of his speeches. Suddenly that went. And what's it been replaced by? It's been replaced, Mr Speaker, with the Minister of Finance telling us that it now constitutes low-value spending and must be cut. Must be cut in tomorrow's budget because now, suddenly, our 3- and 4-year-olds constitute low-value spending, when once they were a high priority under this government. And the families and the parents of those children believed that government, but they're about to be betrayed. Because let's have a listen what the National Party was saying prior to the election about early childhood education. This is Paula Bennett, and the quote from Paula Bennett is, she said before the election, "We want to assure parents that our policy is not going to mean an increase in fees for them." That was Paula Bennett, spokesperson for early childhood education for National before the 2008 election. But what's changed? Because this week the Prime Minister, John Key, confirmed that some parents will pay more for early childhood education. All I can tell you, he said, is that some parents may be affected in the budget, but certainly not the majority. Some may pay more. Well, let's have a look at what that majority might look like. Because one of the things that the media has been speculating on is that the funding cut for early childhood education will come for those centres who employ 80 to 100% of qualified staff. That's the speculation that that funding band will go. Well, what would that mean? Currently, 2,211 early childhood education services access that funding band. So what does that mean for families? 108,000 children and families, and I'll say that again, Mr Speaker, 108,000 children and their families will be affected if that is the funding cut that is made to early childhood education tomorrow. And I noticed that all of the National Party members across the way there have gone quiet with the exception of Paul Quinn. He may think that it's okay for 108,000 children and their families to face the prospect of increasing costs to their families, because that's what would happen if that funding cut goes ahead tomorrow. It represents 60% of all the children in early childhood education services in 2009 were actually in services that would be affected by that funding cut. So if the National Party does go ahead with that particular funding cut, can they still claim that they haven't touched 20 hours free ECE? Well, no, Mr Speaker, they could not. They could not, because parents with their children accessing 20 hours free ECE, if they are in those centres, those 2,211 centres, will face the prospect of higher fees, even for those 20 hours. So that's the betrayal. That's the nature of the betrayal that we could well be seeing tomorrow. And what are we going to see in return? The wealthy getting wealthier. And that is the thing that I think is disgraceful about the prospect of cutting funding to early childhood education. Because suddenly all we hear from the National Party is that it's too costly. It used to be a high priority, but suddenly it's too costly. What's it too costly for? It's too costly because they want to give whopping big tax cuts to the wealthiest people in this country. And that's where the money will be going from early childhood education. Make no mistake about it, money out of middle and low income families for their children's education into the pockets of the wealthiest people in this country. And that's what we'll be facing. And I was interested to hear the National Party members talk about that they will judge their own budget on fairness and equity. Well, so will I. And the fairness and equity I'll be looking for is where the money goes from early childhood education. How many millions? Because the prospect that I'm laying out is that possibly 108,000 children and their families will be affected by this. That's on top of and as well as the 11,000 families we already know that government's made a decision to disadvantage by cutting the childcare allowance. totally different entitlement, but affecting that same group of families as well. Mr Speaker, tomorrow we will learn just the extent of the betrayal, because those parents trusted the government. They will be justified in feeling betrayed.
Order.